Welcome to Ira's Everything Bagel, where I talk with intriguing people about everything, their passions, pursuits, and points of view. My guest today is Burt Kearns, journalist, television and film producer, and he's author of the new book, Lawrence Tierney, Hollywood's Real-Life Tough Guy, published by the University Press of Kentucky and available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all the usual places. To order the book, go to lawrencetierneybook.com, and for a signed copy, you can go to larryedmonds.com, and you can follow the book, not Burt, on Twitter at Tough Guy Tierney and on Instagram at Lawrence Tierney Book. And Burt, first of all, welcome to the show. And second of all, am I been screwing up his name? Did I get Tierney or Tierney? Which is the best one?
Tierney, Lawrence Tierney.
I thought so, but occasionally I slip. I think it's lack of sleep. Who knows?
That's an issue with the book and with Lawrence Tierney is when you mention Lawrence Tierney, they go, who? Who's Lawrence Tierney? Then you explain and they go, oh, that guy.
We should note that just yesterday, it was his birthday.
Yes.
I mean, he died in 2002, but even so, we should acknowledge that.
104 years old, had he made it.
Just a little bit about him first, and I want to get into the book. He was an actor. He had this swagger about him and his gruff disposition. And that was both on and evidently off screen, as we'll talk about. Why did you decide to write a biography of Lawrence Tierney?
A couple of reasons. One, I was doing research on another project, and I came upon an article, a story online, and it was from about 1952, and it said, Lawrence Tierney arrested for the 13th time. So that's pretty interesting. So I looked into it, and I saw it was a story of this actor who had been arrested for being drunk for the 13th time. Did a little more research and realized it wasn't the 13th time. It was more like the 22nd time in the last 5 years or so. And then I recalled, I drank with this guy once. Back in the early 90s, there was a bar called the Formosa Cafe, a Chinese restaurant in Santa Monica Boulevard in Hollywood.
I think it's still open now, isn't it?
Still there. It'd been around since the 1930s, and in the 40s and 50s, that's where Elvis went there, and Ava Gardner and all the celebrities would go there because the Warner lot was right next door. In the 90s, some of those old people were still hanging out at the bar, as well as a young generation. Look in the booth over there, and there's Quentin Tarantino, and there's Keanu Reeves, and there's an old guy sitting at the bar with a short sleeve shirt, drinking whiskey out of a bucket, one of those big glasses. And I was sitting next to him at the bar, and I said, I think that's the guy that was in Reservoir Dogs, the old guy from Reservoir Dogs. And he said, how you doing? I'm Larry. And we chatted. And I don't remember what we talked about, but I remember that there was no brawl, no fighting, which I kind of felt bad about later when I learned more about his history. Here was this guy, Irish American from Brooklyn. He worked as a sand hog, and he worked in factories. And at the same time, he also worked as a model. And he was discovered, came to Hollywood, to RKO Radio Pictures in 1943 with promises of being a star. And they didn't do much with him. They put him in little odd uncredited roles here and there. And they were about to get rid of his contract in 1945 when he saw an ad in the trade saying that they were casting a movie in an area called Poverty Row, which were all the independent low-budget studios were, about a gangster named John Dillinger. So as the myth goes, and as the story goes, he left the studio, walked up a mile up Gower Street, up to Sunset Boulevard, walked into the office of the producers, swiped a script from the secretary, learned a scene, came in, did a read. He got the role as John Dillinger in this low-budget picture. RKO Radio Pictures rented him out for $100 a week for 3 weeks. Picture came out, overnight sensation. Lawrence Tierney was Dillinger. The movie was a hit. Dillinger mania spread across America. Lawrence Tierney overnight was a star. 2 weeks later, he was arrested in Beverly Hills for being drunk. Goes to court, gets a $10 fine. A week after that, arrested again. A week after that. Long story short, at the end of his career, Lawrence Tierney made about 60 films, had more than 30 television roles, and more than 70 arrests. This is a guy who basically drank and brawled away his career in the first 5 years. But what made the story different was that he kept going. He always found a way to keep going. If the heat got too heavy in LA, he moved to New York. If the heat got heavy in New York, when he's banned from all the bars in New York, he goes to Europe. And there's always a producer who wants to give him another shot because he was a nice guy when he wasn't drinking. In the end, Lawrence Tierney made an incredible comeback much later in life. In the early days, he was a handsome, scary, nobody was scarier in these film noir movies than Lawrence Tierney, Born to Kill, The Devil Thumbs a Ride. He made this comeback in the 80s as sort of, he was described by one of the characters in Reservoir Dogs as the Thing, a big, bald, burly guy who talked like this, and he was fat, and he was, but he's a great actor. He made films with John Huston, Jack Nicholson, Andy Warhol, Quentin Tarantino, John Sayles, James Cagney. He had this, John Cassavetes. He wound up having this whole second career as an old man in Hollywood, where people like me met him when I was younger, and he was still raising hell to the very end. He made it to 82 years old somehow.
How did he keep the drinking under control while he was filming films?
He always claimed that he didn't drink while he was working, which really wasn't that true. He was getting arrested, in the middle of shoots. He was getting arrested and having to step into jail for a few weeks at a time, in between shoots. He always said that Tierney had issues. Obviously, today we would have said that he was, bipolar. He obviously had some sort of mental issues, and he also was a diehard alcoholic, and really always said that when he would do an interview, he'd say, I'm a prisoner to this. I've tried Alcoholics Anonymous. I keep trying, but it doesn't work. And what did the press do? Aha, there's Lawrence Tierney thinking he's Dillinger. There was no sympathy for this guy throughout. They didn't really understand what his issue was. And the worst was the legal system. I mentioned that story about him being in jail, being arrested for the 13th time. He'd been arrested for the 13th time, they said, or he appeared before this judge for the 13th time. And the judge looked at his record and said, Mr. Tierney, this is the 13th time you've been before me. This is ridiculous. I find you, you keep getting in fights, you keep getting drunk. It's time right now, we're going to have to send you to jail. You're going to go to jail and you're going to learn your lesson. But if you promise never to drink again, I'll let you off with a fine. Your Honor, I promise I'll never drink again.
Of course.
This happened over and over again. And so, it's sad. It's a tragic story. What makes it a little bit, more tragic is the fact that he was a great actor. When people see his films now from the 1940s and 50s, they go, wow, this guy was great. And then when you see his work that he did in the 80s, some of the best work he did in the 80s was on television, where he was on shows like Hunter and, St. Elsewhere. He had a great role on Hill Street Blues.
Well, you mentioned also he was in Seinfeld, wasn't he?
Well, Seinfeld, that's a typical, you want me to tell the Seinfeld story?
Absolutely.
Typical Lawrence Tierney story. Here he is. He's an old man. He's probably, in his 70s by then. He gets a role. An actor who was on Seinfeld, who had worked with him back in the 70s, says he'd be great to play Elaine's father, Julia Louis-Dreyfus's father in the show. So they go, great. They write an episode. It's called The Jacket, and he plays a person he's a writer and a World War II vet who has to meet Jerry and George Costanza, and he scares the hell out of them. He's gruff and he's scary and this and that. Well, Tierney shows up and he sits at the table. He doesn't get any of the jokes. He's saying, who's this guy Steinfeld? I've worked with Jack Benny and people like that. This guy's not funny. What's funny about this? And they go, no, just do the role. This is great. Does the role. He's in his deadpan way. He's hilarious. They love him. The producer, the director, they go, Larry David, he's like, got to bring this guy back. He's going to be a regular. So that means, Larry's going to get insurance. He's going to have a regular pay. He's got a recurring role on a hit show. Until they're filming the final scene, they're in the Seinfeld apartment set, and the actors are on one side of the stage. There's an audience there, and Larry is in the kitchen area of the Seinfeld set, and they notice that he takes a large knife out of the butcher block in the kitchen and slips it in his jacket. And Julia Louis-Dreyfus looks over at Jason Alexander. Did you see? I saw that. Yeah, I'm not going to say anything. And he goes, did he just? And they look at the director. The director says, the guy just put a knife in his jacket. Well, Jerry Seinfeld sees it, walks over to him and says, so, Larry, what's with the knife? And Tierney's a bit embarrassed. And he says, well, this was just in case I had to stab you in the heart. And then he took the knife and did an imitation of the Psycho scene and went, over Jerry Seinfeld. And they said, security, get this guy out of here.
Wow.
And he lost the gig.
Did he ever explain that in your research? Did he ever explain why he acted that way, or is he just so far gone that?
Two things. One, he was a comedian. He thought he was funny. He thought that was really, really funny.
Oh, okay.
Number
Okay.
one.
Got
And
it.
number two, he unfortunately later in life became a real kleptomaniac. He couldn't help but steal things. I talked to a lot of the people that were younger that hung out with him in those days, and they would be in a diner or a restaurant, and all of a sudden Tierney would stop in the men's room and come back and go, "Let's get out of here now, quick, we got to get out." And his pockets are full of silverware or salt and pepper shakers. A guy that Tierney was living with during the Seinfeld shoot, David Del Valle, a Hollywood historian, says that he was getting calls from the Seinfeld office during the shoot saying, all the staplers are gone, and all, he's stealing things off the desk. He couldn't help himself. So he was quite a character.
But you think being an alcoholic, he would just steal booze?
No, he had lots of issues like that.
Right.
He also was a diehard. I don't know if you bring this up, but he had an issue with public urination. One of the directors he worked with said that, if he walked into a men's room and there were 12 urinals there, he'd just walk right past and go out into the street. And there were several incidents where that happened. He lost the role in the movie Joe. I don't remember the movie Joe with Peter Boyle.
Mm-hmm.
Made Peter Boyle a star. Lawrence Tierney was originally set to star in that role until they were doing a wardrobe fitting at a department store in New York City, and he apparently urinated on the escalator, and they said, "Get this guy out of here." The most famous one is at the Egyptian Theater. This is one of his last public appearances. It was a tribute to Robert Wise, the great director who had directed Tierney in Born to Kill back in 1947. Tierney was not invited to this gala at the Egyptian Theater, but showed up anyway. And he showed up, and people said, "It's Lawrence Tierney." Wow. And he was infirm, he was older. And these guys, they brought him in, they sat him down in the theater. And then there was a Q&A, and Tierney heckled, he heckled Robert Wise from the back of the theater. And then the movie began. And person sitting next to Tierney, who turned out to be Eddie Muller, who is known as the czar of noir. He's a film noir expert who appears on TCM. Tierney said, "Get me a cup. I need a cup." And he said, "Okay." And it was the Egyptian Theater, and the Prince of Egypt had just played there, the Disney film. And he went to the concession stand and came back with a big cup that said the Prince of Egypt on it. And in the middle of the film, Tierney stood up, dropped his pants, and began to urinate into the cup. Unfortunately, there was a woman sitting in front of him, and it was very loud. And Muller said, he just sat there going, "Please don't turn around. Please don't turn around. Please don't turn around." And of course, the woman turns around. And Tierney said something to the effect of, "What's the matter? Ain't you never seen one of these before?" And
yeah,
that's a Tierney story that's gone down in history, Hollywood history.
I mean, Hollywood's not exactly the most normal town, yet that behavior seems to obviously cross even those lines to where I'm amazed that based on your stories and research that he was able to find work. I understand why. He was talented and he was very well known, and after Dillinger launched him. But once you have too many of these episodes of either kleptomania or public urination or other situations, pulling out a knife, I mean.
Well, one of the issues was, here we were in the late 1980s and in the 1990s, and you had these young filmmakers, people like Quentin Tarantino, who would find out that Lawrence Tierney is still alive. At one point, there was a guy named C. Courtney Joyner. He's a scriptwriter and a director. He was good friends with Larry. Courtney was in his 20s. Larry was in his late 60s, and Courtney had the same management as Quentin Tarantino. This is before Quentin had made before he had made Reservoir Dogs. And Quentin showed him a script that he wrote, and it was Reservoir Dogs. And he said, I've got this other script called True Romance that somebody else is directing, but I want to direct this script. And at the top of the script, it was dedicated to about 8 different people, Hirakawa, Timothy Carey, people like that, and Lawrence Tierney. And Courtney said, "You've dedicated this to Lawrence Tierney?" And Tarantino said, "Oh yeah, he died. He was killed in a gunfight in Mexico. He was the worst guy around." And Courtney said, "No, he's not. He lives behind the library. I see him every week." And so he went and introduced Tarantino to Lawrence Tierney, and he hired him on to play the old man who runs the gang in the film Reservoir Dogs. And they made a few calls, and the producer Lawrence Bender called a couple of people who had worked with Tierney and said, "You know, anything we should know about working with Mr. Tierney?" Well, yeah, you know, number one, he needs a handler. He'll get bored in the middle of a shoot and walk away and just like start hanging out with somebody else in the street. You need a handler. He's, you know, you got to be careful with this guy. He loses his concentration. He said, "Don't worry, we'll take care of it." Well, Quentin Tarantino hires Lawrence Tierney. They shoot the scenes for the first week. They're at the last shot of the last day of the first week, and the whole week, you know, Tierney he doesn't get the jokes in the script. He doesn't. This is repetitive. This isn't funny. What is this? He's blaming the other guy. He's forgetting his lines and this and that. And they're shooting. It was actually the opening scene of the film, in which they're at the pancake house, and they had to do one more shot with Tierney. And Quentin says, "You know, Larry," and Tierney would walk away in the middle of Quentin trying to tell him what to do. So Quentin grabs his Larry, stop. Tierney says, "Get your hands off me." The next thing you know, they're fighting, and you know, young Tarantino and this old man are swinging at each other, and Tarantino stops and says, "You're fired. Get off my set. You're fired." And he walks away, and they said the crew applauded. And then the producer and Harvey Keitel, who was one of the actors there who had broken up the fight, says, "You know, you can't fire this guy. We'd shot most of his scenes, and we can't afford to reshoot them. You got to hire him back." So he hired him back and got through the shoot. But that was the thing that happened constantly through the 90s. You have these young guys who wanted to work with the legend. The producer of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the producer of Star Trek The Next Generation, had Tierney in it because they wanted to work with Lawrence Tierney. The producer, the showrunner of The Simpsons, had a character named Don Brodka, and he was, ironically, a store security guard who catches Bart shoplifting. And they wanted Lawrence Tierney in his Reservoir Dogs to play the voice of Don Brodka. Well, Tierney, they bring Tierney in, and Lawrence Tierney's going to be here today. This is great. Well, Tierney gets there. The first thing he does, he hits on a female production assistant, then he doesn't get the jokes. "I'm not reading this. Isn't funny." It's like, please just read the jokes. "Well, I think I should do it in a Southern accent." A Southern accent? No. You got to do it like the guy from Reservoir Dogs. And they said it was the wildest, most difficult shoot they ever had. Yet the producer today says it was the most memorable. We worked with Lawrence Tierney. It was the greatest. They gave like a little tribute to him when he died on The Simpsons. So there you go. I mean, the young folks got to work with the old legend, you know.
And I could see that when you find out someone that you grew up watching on the silver screen and idolize, and you find out they're still alive. They may be in their 80s or 90s at this point, but they're still alive. You want to do something with them. Absolutely. Burt, how did you start your research on Lawrence Tierney? In other words, did you first talk to people and then do more intensive research with written materials, or did you start in the library and then go into talking with people? And how did you reach people who might have remembered Lawrence Tierney?
Well, I did sort of the opposite. I began to research Tierney through various websites and newspapers and libraries, and then the pandemic hit, and the lockdown started. So I sat down and I just started taking every story out of books, out of newspapers, magazines, everywhere, and I just wrote them. I typed them out, and I wound up with about 800 single-spaced pages. And then I started from the beginning and started reading it. Oh, great. There's Lawrence Tierney, you know, young guy, going to Manhattan College. Oh, good. Oh, he's been discovered. Look at that. Oh, there's a nice article about him. Oh, he's in Hollywood. And oh no, ouch. And now he's got it. Oh, no. And then as I kept reading it, it was like one step forward, two steps backwards through the whole thing. And so I sort of took it as sort of a mystery myself to see, you know, where is he going to screw up next?
Right.
And then I found people who knew him. I found his family members, first of all. He had two nephews, one of whom was the son of the actor Scott Brady. Scott Brady had his own very successful career. He was in movies like Johnny Guitar with Joan Crawford, and he had a TV series called Shotgun Slade. He was Lawrence Tierney's younger brother, who came to Hollywood in the late 40s after being a war hero, and was discovered. Lawrence introduced him to a producer. He was discovered, and the people said, you know, this is great, but you might want to change your name from Tierney because your brother's got kind of reputation here. So he became Scott Brady for the rest of his life.
Interesting.
On screen. One of Scott Brady's final roles were in the China Syndrome with Jack Lemmon and Jane Fonda, and he was also in Gremlins. He played the old corrupt sheriff who the Gremlins all get at the end. But he died young. He died at about age 60, and he had emphysema and other issues. So we had Scott Brady's son, Larry's nephew, who never knew he had an uncle, Larry, until he was about 14 years old. He found it accidentally because the brothers had a falling out, and Larry was not a nice person as far as the family was concerned. So Scott Brady never talked about his brother as Tim was growing up. He had another brother named Edward Tierney, who was in acting for a while. Acting wasn't as big a deal for him. Lawrence got him a role in a movie called The Hoodlum, playing his younger brother. He had a minor career in acting, but then moved on from that. He died young as well. And his son, Michael Tierney, in the mid-1980s, after his father had died, reached out to his uncle Larry and sort of became Lawrence's de facto manager and guide, and took care of him for the last 15 years of his life. So we had these two family members who also reached out. Tim helped me a lot in finding other family members and friends. And then there were all these people who sort of work in Hollywood today, or some of them run Hollywood today, who met or knew Lawrence Tierney in the 1980s and 90s. Because when you were friends with Lawrence Tierney, you'd find out he'd be sleeping on your couch and wouldn't leave for 90 days. He was this couch surfer. He had his own place to live,
Right.
but he was an alcoholic and wanted friendship and this and that. And there were so many people who told stories about their friendship with Lawrence Tierney. Two of them, Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski. These are the guys who wrote the movie Ed Wood. They did The People versus O.J. Simpson, Big Eyes, The People versus Larry Flint. Very successful producers and directors and writers. When they first started their careers, Lawrence Tierney lived next door. And so they would be writing in the afternoon, and they said the door would burst open, and it would be like Kramer and Seinfeld just bursting in, and he would talk to them. And they had all these wild stories about Lawrence Tierney. The actor and comedian Patton Oswalt tells the story of sitting at, I think it was the New Beverly Theater, one afternoon watching Citizen Kane. And suddenly there's a ruckus behind him, and a guy starts talking into the screen, etc. And Patton Oswalt turns around to say, "Shut up." Oh, it's Lawrence. It was like looking at an Easter Island statue. He says, "Lawrence Tierney." And Lawrence Tierney sat there and talked to the screen for 15 minutes saying, "You're no guy, you're not funny, you can't sing. Well, who's that? Oh, wow." And then somebody came in and said, "Larry, we got to go. We have to go." And he said, Tierney stood up and went, "I've never seen this picture before. It's not half bad," and left. And Oswald said, this was like unbelievable. This is like my ultimate Hollywood moment, that Lawrence Tierney came in the middle of Citizen Kane, talked to the screen for 15 minutes, and then left. So there's lots of stories like that in the book.
Well, he didn't ask Oswald for a large cup, did he?
No, unfortunately. He would have enjoyed that, I think.
Obviously, when you research anybody, you can go on forever in your research, but at some point you have to say, okay, I have enough for the book. How long of a period before you reach that point and said, you know what, I've got enough material, I'm going to sit down and write this fascinating biography of an actor a lot of people don't recognize initially, but will when you mention some of the movies that he's been in. But how long did it take you before you said, okay, I've got enough material now to sit down and write the book?
Well, I think it was probably about 6 months of research. Then I started writing, and then while I'm writing, I'm also finding new people to interview, and you're finding things all the time, and finding people all the time. I'm getting people referred to me. I'm getting emails from people who are, who had heard that I'm writing the book. And so that kind of went on to the very end. The writing of the bock went on, through, revisions on the book went on, through 2022. So it really was sort of a 2.5 year period where I was working on this.
But you were productive during COVID by writing the book. So that
was the one thing, was that I was able to, I had the time to do it.
Right.
And when the most difficult part was, again, finding someone or a publisher or an agent who would take the book. Because like, who's Lawrence Tierney? And I'm like, wait, this is a great story. Until one day, through my co-author on the book I wrote called The Show Won't Go On, Jeff Abraham, said there's this agent in New York named Lee Sobel, who you might get this. And I got in touch with Lee, and he called me back within like 5 minutes, and he said, I have been trying for 5 years to get Courtney Joyner to write a book about his friend Lawrence Tierney. I don't believe this. And then he introduced me to Courtney. I got Courtney's blessing and cooperation. Great guy. Helped me out a lot. And Lee, within a couple of weeks, had several offers for the book. And there you go. Suddenly we had a publisher. And he was most surprised to find out that it was basically already written. So it was great.
Yeah, that does help.
Yeah.
You had done obviously all the legwork and the hard work and talking to people. Just as a technical thing. So did you, when you were interviewing people by phone or online, did you record the interviews so you could have the reference, or did you just take notes? I always like that.
I recorded everything. I do Zoom interviews where I can.
Right.
Record everything. Some of the interviews are done in person. Luckily, because people are in town here.
Right.
We've got to kind of lug. I'm always at the mercy of the recording equipment. I really don't know how to. I have one of these. I don't know what they're called. But I don't know how to work it. And you find out that it turned off. I know Zoom I could trust, or if I have my little thing. So I did a lot of stuff over Zoom and over phone. I still have all the recordings. And a lot of times, what I'll do is, I'll have the transcripts. I'll send them out to be transcribed, and I'll send them back to the person to make sure that this is correct and it's what they want to say.
No, that's great. And that way you have proof that, in fact, it was a legitimate quote or anecdote. Before I let you go, Burt, your favorite Tierney film, you personally?
My favorite Tierney film is The Devil Thumbs a Ride, where he plays this killer who thumbs a ride with a lingerie salesman, winds up in a vacant beachfront house with a couple of women and the lingerie salesman, and murder ensues and death comes. But it's Tierney at his most wicked, at his most evil that you could ever imagine, but also funny. He's also very funny in it. I think one of his best roles, which you could find on the internet, was Tales from the Dark Side from the early 1980s. He plays an exorcist who's married to Phyllis Diller. And he and Phyllis Diller are a husband and wife team of squabbling comic exorcists. And he's hilarious. And that was the problem. That was part of the tragedy. He was very funny, but nobody could get past the fact that he was also so good at being evil.
Before I let you go, what's the most surprising thing you found out in your research or by interviewing people about Lawrence Tierney?
Well, the most surprising thing I found was how great an actor he was. He never made it to Broadway. A couple of times he almost did. At one point, he got in a fight with the director and stormed off. Another time, he was accused by the director of being drunk and lost the role. But he did a lot of roles in summer stock and out of town from New York. And he did, for instance, The Last Mile, which I believe it was, Spencer Tracy was in the original role. He was compared favorably to Spencer Tracy. He was compared favorably to Humphrey Bogart in The Petrified Forest. He did A Streetcar Named Desire. Well, for one night, he got fired the next. That's another story. But he was compared favorably to Brando and people like that. He was a really great actor. And digging into it and then watching all the films and seeing what he did, he said, wow, this guy was a true talent.
And the thing he had in common with the two other gentlemen you mentioned is they both like to drink. All three like to drink.
Well, it's funny. I don't want to keep going here, but in the late 1970s, he got a role in Death of a Salesman in Philadelphia. Martin Balsam played Willie Loman. Tierney had a role as his brother, I think, who appears as sort of a spirit in it. And of course, before the end of before it even made it to opening night, someone was fired for being drunk and ran away from the production. But it wasn't Tierney. It was the director. George C. Scott was the director. He got drunk and ran away. And guess who took over as director? Arthur Miller himself directed Tierney in A Streetcar Named Desire. So I'm in Death of a Salesman. So as you see, there's these great connections. And that's another part of it, too, that he worked with so many great people.
Well, it's a great story. And you can find out more in the book. My guest has been Burt Kearns. He's journalist, television and film producer, and he's author of the new book, Lawrence Tierney's Hollywood's Real Life Tough Guy, published by the University Press of Kentucky and available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all the usual places. And to order the book, go to lawrencetierneybook.com. And for a signed copy, you can go to larryedmonds.com. And you can follow the book on Twitter at Tough Guy Tierney and on Instagram at Lawrence Tierney Book. And Burt, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. And join us every Thursday for a new schmear on Ira's Everything Bagel.